Alone and isolated from the rest of society, Gein spiraled out of control. Over the next 12 years, he became obsessed with recreating the world he'd shared with his mother. It would lead him to a series of dark and disturbing crimes that would eventually culminate in murder.
One of my summer jobs when I was a student in high school was mowing the cemetery. And two of my buddies and I, that was about a 4-day job for us to mow that. And we would see Ed out there on occasion. He'd come out, and if he saw us working, he'd always come over and say hello. And again, sometimes have this little story to tell. And he was very good about stopping to see his mother's grave.
I think neighbors saw him as an odd, very meek, somewhat simple-minded person, but one who was always willing to pitch in when some farm work needed to be done or some chore needed to be run for them. But they, of course, had no sense of the life that he was pursuing inside that incredibly creepy, dismal world of his own farm.
It was a world that 51-year-old Gein had managed to keep hidden away until the winter of 1957.
November 16th, 1957 was the first day of deer hunting season that year. And it was a day when basically the entire male population of the town would have been out in the woods hunting deer, as Ed knew. Ed drove into town to the Warden hardware store. The Warden hardware store was owned by a woman named Bernice Warden.
I knew Mrs. Warden quite well. She and her family ran the hardware store here for many years. Almost everybody in the community knew Mrs. Warden.
Ed had kind of been hanging around the store for a couple of weeks previously. He had developed something of an obsession with Bernice Warden.
He would talk to her, he would ask her out, and it was quite clear that she really wasn't that interested in him.
Ed came in, asked to buy half a gallon of antifreeze, which Bernice Warden poured out for him and wrote out a receipt. He went back out to his truck, then came back inside and asked her to see a rifle that was in the window. When Bernice Warden turned her back to him, he shot her in the back of the head and then loaded her corpse in his truck and drove back to his farm.
Gein had murdered the 58-year-old woman in broad daylight.
It was deer season, so deer season is like a ghost town around here. Everybody, in those days especially, everybody was out hunting. And she wasn't even missed for for some hours. And when someone reported that she wasn't at the store, well, that was her son, of course.
Later that day, Frank Warden returned from the woods and found the store empty. His mother wasn't there. He was very perplexed by that. And then he saw a trail of blood across the floor of the hardware store, and not only realized, that some foul play had occurred, but immediately suspected Ed Gein, because Gein had been kind of bothering his mother for the past few weeks.
And there was one piece of evidence that confirmed Frank Warden's suspicions to the police.
When they went to search the place, they found the receipt for the antifreeze that was in Ed's name. And they just worked backwards, saying that he was probably the last person to see her alive, but they didn't suspect that he was as deranged as he was.
One set of lawmen went out in search of Gein. They found him having dinner at a neighbor's house, and they arrested him. And then another set of lawmen went out to Gein's farmhouse, and that's where they made these discoveries that really sent shockwaves around the world.
On a dark winter's night, officers from the Plainfield Police Department began to search the Gein farm for Bernice Warden.
They couldn't get into the house, so they went around back and entered into what was called the summer kitchen, which was a little shed outside.
This property didn't have any electricity, so they were pretty much fumbling around in the dark with flashlights, but I don't think they expected to find what they did find there.
One of them turned on his flashlight and beamed it around and saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. Although it didn't look like a deer, they realized to their incredible horror that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels and been completely gutted.
She'd been strung up, essentially, and she was slit from her sternum to her pelvis. So she'd essentially been butchered by Ed. It really was the most grotesque thing that these officers had ever come across.
And they realized they had found the body of Bernice Warden. And of course, both of them just stumbled out in horror and vomited, at the sight of this thing.
When the news spread across the town, the residents of Plainfield were in complete shock.
When I heard of his arrest, I couldn't believe it. I was sure they had the wrong person because it just didn't seem like anything that they were telling us was the Ed that we all knew. Yeah, it was a Saturday night. We were at a dance, and the story went through there, and everybody said, "I don't believe it," but it was true.
After finding the butchered body of Bernice Warden in a shed at Ed Gein's farm, the police officers moved their search into the main house.
He boarded up some areas of the family's home to maintain the rooms as his mother had left them. And in other parts of the property, he just started hoarding things. You would have trash and rubbish build up, and it really became a complete hovel.
He'd reverse the normal process of trash disposal, and instead of taking all his garbage to the dump, would go to the dump and bring it into his house. It was just this incredible chaos of trash and garbage.
But there was more than just household waste.
Amid all that wreckage, they discovered these incomprehensible, unspeakably awful objects that had been fashioned out of human body parts. There were chairs that were upholstered in human flesh.
There was a lampshade made of human skin. They found the remains of 12 human heads, gloves made out of the skin from a corpse's fingers.
There was a jar containing human noses. There was a box full of female genitalia, some of which had been painted and tied with ribbons. There was a belt fashioned out of female nipples. There was a shade pull made of human lips.
They found all types of things that belonged to people that were no longer people. And it was shocking. I mean, you think of this happening, now, it'd still be shocking. But back then, in a small, tiny rural community, it was absolutely, it was breathtaking.
Ed Gein's farmhouse was the habitation of a literal ghoul. Somebody who had been living amidst these horrific relics of human dismemberment. It was a madhouse.
Gein's fascination with death and corpses had been growing ever since his mother had died 12 years previously.
Ed had always enjoyed reading. It was quite a solitary pursuit, so that's not particularly surprising. But after the death of his mother and his brother, he started to read an awful lot more, and his tastes in literature really did span quite a wide spectrum. He read pornographic magazines, he read medical textbooks, and he developed a particular interest in Ilse Koch, who worked at one of the Nazi concentration camps and collected patches of skin of the prisoners who were detained there. And I think all of this was fueling a very active imagination. So he's developing these obsessions and these interests, and he's quite skilled as a farmhand at this point in time. He knows how to slaughter animals, he knows how to prepare carcasses. He's from a community that's very much into its hunting and its fishing. So at some point, reality and fantasy are going to collide.